Welcome to Flashpoints. I'm Jeff Pegues. Joining me from New York, CBS News senior national security analyst Juan Zarate. The Department of Justice announcing what it calls historic penalties against some of the world's largest banks, accusing Citicorp, JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, and RBS of manipulating the foreign exchange rate and collusion. DOJ also announced more than $5 billion in fines and penalties, and a list of banks that included UBS, which, according to the Department of Justice, is a repeat offender. So, Juan, what does this mean for Main Street USA?
Well, it demonstrates that the Department of Justice and the regulators, in addition to the prosecutors, are keeping a focus on the banks, the major global banks around the world, for a range of criminal activities. And the fact is that the Department of Justice is now demanding criminal liability for these banks and imposing enormous fines to the tune of billions of dollars. For Main Street America, in some ways, I think it answers the call for holding major banks to account for things like collusion, manipulating the exchange rate, taking advantage of their position in the financial system and order. It also raises the debate, and you hear this over and over, about whether or not individuals versus just banks are going to be held to account. The populist call for bankers themselves to be in handcuffs versus just banks being fined billions of dollars is really a theme that you will continue to hear, and is not satiated simply with these actions. But this demonstrates, again, aggressive enforcement actions by the government that will continue against major global banks.
Yeah, and this is a topic that you're well aware of. You've written the book Treasury's War, which deals with money laundering. But as you know, there is a lot of pressure on these banks, regulatory pressure, ever since 2008 and the financial crisis.
No, absolutely. A lot of doubt as to whether or not the banks can clean up their act. You've had the LIBOR scandal, this Forex scandal. You've had the anti-money laundering and sanctions violations to the tune of billions of dollars. And so real questions from regulators and prosecutors as to whether or not the banks can be relied on to manage their risk and to avoid these kinds of manipulative situations and criminal acts. On the other hand, the banks are feeling enormous pressure. They feel like they're being eaten away at, and they're being asked to de-risk and to do things that not only undermine their business, but really may not be good for the system. Things like not providing banking services to particular types of people or particular markets because it's too risky now. They feel the pressure. And so this is a really dynamic environment. It's one worth watching, and this is just one episode in a larger series of actions being undertaken against major banks, principally driven out of the Department of Justice and New York regulators and even the Treasury Department.
But as you noted, there is a lot of pressure on regulators as well to do something, to rein in some of the fraud and the criminal acts that they say are happening on Wall Street and other places in the financial industry. Do you think Department of Justice and other regulators are doing enough to rein in this kind of activity?
Well, it's a great question. And, Jeff, what you've seen over the years is that just as bank CEOs and compliance officers have been put on the hot seat before the Klieg lights of Congress, you've also had the regulators, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the Office of Thrift Supervision, and others be called to task for not having done enough to understand what the risks were, where the risks were in general in the system, why they didn't understand not just the crisis that led us to the Great Recession in 2008, but also where these particular vulnerabilities and criminal acts were happening. And so the regulators do not like being put on the spot and don't like being the target of congressional or public attention. And that's why you've seen regulators and prosecutors now getting even more aggressive with financial institutions.
But every time we ask the question, will there be more arrests, we tend to get the same answer, which is the investigation is still underway. So we're not seeing a whole lot of perp walks, if you will. We're not seeing a lot of traders and others connected to some of these crimes, according to DOJ, being paraded out in handcuffs.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge here is not that the Department of Justice doesn't want to prosecute individuals. You can imagine there is great political sort of energy behind having a banker's scalp on your wall if you're a prosecutor. I was a former prosecutor. If you're in that situation, you want to try to prosecute those types of big cases. The challenge, though, is proving knowledge, intent to commit the particular crimes. Now, with the foreign exchange scandal and collusion, there is a fair bit of information that demonstrates antitrust violations, not just by the institutions, but by particular traders and individuals acting as a bit of a cartel. And so I imagine that the investigation around those individuals and their supervisors are ongoing. But it's often difficult to prove knowledge and culpability for an individual versus an entire bank that has failed systemically.
It is a challenge for DOJ, and we'll see where it goes from here. Juan Zarate, I'm Jeff Pegues, and that is Flashpoints.